Hey, deserving listeners, this is chapter 3 in our deep dive on the Duggar family with my best friend and co-host on the podcast, Humberto Castaneda, who has a great shirt on, Psychology in Seattle. So welcome to the podcast. Let's get into it. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castaneda, and I train in the ways of the Jedi.
So, timeline. This is the chapter for the timeline. Let's begin at the beginning. 1984, Jim Bob and Michelle are married, just weeks after Michelle's high school graduation. Not a crime. Plenty of people get married. My parents got married when they were 19, but, you know, notable on some level. 1988, skipping ahead 4 years, Josh was born. The first child of 19 eventual children, not counting miscarriages. Michelle was on the pill prior to this, went off the pill to get pregnant with Josh. After Josh was born, she went back on the pill.
Yep.
So pretty common American story there. You have a couple that is managing their family, family planning. And she became pregnant again, though, while she was on the pill, which happens sometimes. Sometimes it's because of just the way hormones work and you can't guarantee things, or you didn't take the pill correctly or so, who knows. But she got pregnant again. And one of the things in my notes, I'm like, do you think Jim Bob might have messed with the pill? And because, you can change the placebo out or something. I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
It's just accidents will happen.
Yeah. So she miscarried, though, which was a very difficult moment for her. So let's talk about miscarriage trauma, Berto.
Sure.
For those of you who have been with me a long time, you know that I have an unfinished manuscript on grief. I've been writing this book on grief, and a good portion of it is on what we call disenfranchised grief, which is this term meaning that there are certain losses in life that we feel natural grief around, and it can be just as difficult as any other loss, but the culture doesn't acknowledge it or doesn't allow individuals to process it normally. Generally, all losses are disenfranchised, but some are particularly, one being those who go through miscarriage. And it's not just the pregnant person going through it's potentially the spouse and everyone else in the family. So, it's hard. And not only is it losing a child, because as soon as you learn that you're pregnant and you planning having the child, you start thinking of the future and you start having a connection with that creature. So it not only is that loss just horrific, right? Just the experience of losing a child. I mean, everyone understands that if, for example, you had a 5-year-old who had leukemia and died, that is devastating. Well, it can be very similar to having an unborn child die. It can be really hard.
And the thing is, so no one talks about this. Like, no one says, hey, you might have a miscarriage. Like, that's not a thing anyone ever mentions. So, you go through it and you think, I'm just going to have a baby here. And then if a miscarriage happens, it's like, did I do something wrong? Why are we messed up. Like, where did we mess up? We got to go and review everything we've done, because this isn't supposed to happen.
Right. Or is there something wrong with my body? Yeah. Did I do something wrong? Did I exercise too much? Did I not eat the right way?
And it's an absolute loss.
Yeah. And I think that might specifically even play a role with Michelle. I don't know. But so not only is it a loss of a child, which is horrific, right? And difficult, but also sometimes the physical experience of having a miscarriage can be very difficult, right? Yeah. There can be a lot of, we don't go into details on the different experiences, but
very traumatic.
But yeah, I mean, it can be, well, you don't have to think too hard about what it could be like to have a miscarriage to know that it can be physically extremely difficult, not only obviously painful and scary, but it can be
traumatizing,
graphic in terms of how it plays out. And it's been estimated that 50% of all women have experienced a miscarriage at some point in their life.
Right.
So this isn't a rare thing, even though it's never talked about, right?
Yeah. And I think part of it is that it's like, you don't want to jinx it or it's taboo or whatever, but it's like, you're doing the opposite then, because if you don't talk about it, if you don't prepare people for it, then it's that much more devastating and secret, and you don't want to talk about it. That's the other thing. Like if you hadn't announced the pregnancy and it happens, it's bad. If you'd announced the pregnancy and it happens, it's bad. If it's the first time you're trying to have a child, you might think you'll never be able to have a child.
Yeah.
If it's, you know,
imagine if we extended this beyond birth, right? That, well, I don't want to tell anyone that I have a child, because what if the child develops some sort of early life terminal illness and they die? So I'm going to not tell anyone that I have a young child at home going to school at times, because now why do people do that? Well, it's because our society is so weird about death and anything other than the happy stories.
Happy outcomes are fine. We don't discuss the alternatives.
Yeah, you'll experience people will get upset at you if you talk about a difficult. You go to a dinner party and you bring up your miscarriage that happened recently or 5 years ago. People would be. I would imagine most people would be like, "That's rude that they brought that up." Yeah, you can't bring up sad stories.
By the way, this is one of the reasons we can't have a reasonable, rational conversation around abortion, for example, because the expectation is like, no, happy outcomes. That's the only thing we'll tolerate here.
Right.
But sometimes they're not happy outcomes.
Yeah. So if half of all women, according to one study, have experienced a miscarriage at some point in their life, which is surprising, I'm guessing, to a lot of people, you'd think, well, it's pretty rare. No, it happens frequently.
All the time.
And I think this study was actually looking at miscarriages that people noticed, because there's also a whole set of miscarriages that are pre even someone knowing that they're pregnant, right?
Well, one interesting thing is, like, if you rewind the clock 100 years, or maybe even only 60 years or something, losing kids that were young was very common. And it was, of course, traumatic, but it was a thing. It's like, oh yeah, like I remember my grandma lost a child. Almost everyone I knew from that generation, and I'm not talking about a miscarriage. I'm talking about like, oh yeah, they were 2, they were 5, because there was more disease, there was more childhood illness. One stat I was reading about the Victorian age in England is that they frequently cite that the average mortality age was like 40. But that's only because they include all the deaths prior to 5 years old. If you survived after 5, you actually had a good chance to get to your 70s, mid-70s.
Right. It's this huge myth that I grew up thinking that the typical lifespan was 40 years, but that's because of this stat, right?
But you were actually pretty likely to die within the first 5 years.
Right.
But nowadays, we're not familiar with that, right? And I think we sort of like took it to this other extreme. Like,
it still happens and is still totally disenfranchised or ignored or something.
But we kind of took it to this other extreme, which is like, you get pregnant, you have a baby. It just works.
Right. And never mind the shame and disenfranchisement of people having the experience of having a hard time getting pregnant, right?
Right.
Although that's getting a little better.
Yeah, but anyway. I know several couples that are friends of mine who had to go through the therapy stuff, all the science stuff to make it happen.
Right. Yeah. So, and then all the internalized shame. It's just like, I'm not a real woman, or I'm not a real man, or I'm not a real human because my body isn't working the way that it's depicted in culture. So, specifically though, what will happen according to research is that many parents report that friends and family will say after a miscarriage, if the individual feels safe enough to disclose it, that people will say, you can have another kid. So just imagine that your 5-year-old child dies and people are like, oh yeah, you can have another one. Renner et al. In the year 2000, a study, participants read vignettes of a miscarriage. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of findings, but one of them was that 87% of the responses were by the participants. They were asked, like, how would you respond to this friend or family member telling you that they went through a miscarriage? 87%. So, a vast majority of the responses were included an attempt to minimize the importance of the loss, such as, I would, someone says, I would tell her that she can try again. Yeah. And it's this attempt at trying to help, but because there's no sophistication around the understanding of the experience, people have difficulty with true empathy because they don't really understand what's happening because it's never talked about. When someone says, you can try again, it'll be very hurtful potentially, right? But it's not because people are inherently, it's sort of like when you have a death in your family, like your one of your parents dies, and people are just like, well, thoughts and prayers. It's not because people don't care.
Right.
It's because there's no protocol. Everything in our culture is protocolized. When you go to the restaurant and a waitress comes up to your table in the United States, there's a whole procedure. Everyone understands. There's they bring out the water, and then they say, how you doing? And can I get you a drink? And they bring you the menus. There's a whole system there. Well, when it comes to grief, if you have a system, then people know where to slot in. They know their role. Like, I'm really close to this person. That means that I'm able to do this. I don't know if that's what I can do, but I can test that out. Well, I'm sort of mid-tier closeness. So that means that I should offer this, and not because I should, but because I know what I want, and I also know what is typical, and I know what's expected, and I know what the person probably wants me to do. Whereas when you have no protocol, then everyone runs for the hills.
Dude, that's right. We only learn, again, the happy, positive outcome protocols. Someone comes to you and says, dude, I just passed my bar exam, or I just closed on the house I was trying to buy. We have a protocol.
Right.
Oh my God, that's awesome. High five. Let's have a drink. Let's go celebrate. Like, it's obvious.
Well, and
it's
also,
understood.
like with the house, for example, let me see pictures.
Totally.
And when are we having our housewarming party? And then when you have the housewarming party, you bring a little thing, and you go, oh my God, those draperies, those drapes are great. Or this is a really, you know what things to say. There's so much light in this room.
Right.
Like,
but we're not well trained when it's like, we lost the house. What do you say? Oh, I'm sorry to hear.
You can get another one.
You can always get another house.
Well, that's rude that you're bringing that bummer up. Geez, morbid or something.
Yeah. And that's just like, the tip of the iceberg. Like, certainly, I actually try to force myself when someone posts something really sad or tragic on Facebook. I force myself to, if I'm gonna write something, like, I try to write something that I can pass to them or something. So as an example, I usually try to talk about like moments that we need to enjoy, because that's the only thing we have. Like, so moments of like remembering special moments that we had, or like, I'll write something special. If I had a memory with them, of course because I've always felt that like either I shouldn't say anything, because just like, oh, that's horrible to hear.
It depends.
It depends. Like, for me, I don't like, that's part of why I never post news on Facebook, because responses like that would do nothing for me. In fact, it would almost only add noise to my life. Like, yeah. Whereas like if I actually, and we talked about this, like, that's part of the reason why I think I never used to tell people, even my closest friends, when I had health emergencies, right? Or when I had really bad problems. It's because not only am I not trained with what to do when someone tells me that, but I don't know what to do when I'm in it and someone's going to respond to it.
Right. No one knows what to do. So everyone just avoids it. And meanwhile, everyone suffers, particularly the person going through the loss, because they're not able to, grief for most of the time, for most of us, is a social experience, a social emotional experience. There's a process to it. You inform people that you had this tragedy. They console you. They show empathy. You feel validated. Right. You feel held. People might even do favors for you, like do your errands for you or something. They reminisce with you. They also are suffering too, is the thing,
right.
So everyone is that's why we have these traditions, like the processional through the streets, and then the burial, and the crying, and the wearing of the black. Particular cultures will do this kind of thing. Those aren't traditions just because someone just made it up for no reason. It develops out of a culture, for a reason, because it serves a very important social emotional experience. Anyway, so another thing from my manuscript, by the way, I actually looked at my manuscript in the bit on miscarriage, disenfranchised grief. I was reminded of a story of a friend of mine lost a child just before birth, like literally a day before or the day of.
Oh, dude.
And she wanted to hold the child. The child was deceased, but she asked the hospital, the medical providers, if she could hold the child, right?
Yeah.
And so they said, of course. And so she's holding the child for a long time. And she asked her family to take a picture of her with the child, because she knew she would, after handing over the child, she would probably never see the child again, right? And so she had a picture taken. And later she sent the picture to a few select friends. And I think I have this right. I'm not quite sure, but from my memory, she said that others thought it was uncouth in some way, that it was weird or something morbid or,
right.
But you could absolutely imagine people thinking that, right?
Yeah.
Like,
well, like for example, you know that trend that like 100 years ago or whatever, when they would take pictures of dead kids and it was a thing to remember them or whatever.
Yeah. People,
but to us, it seems kind of gory or horrific.
People equate it with like you're Jeffrey Dahmer or something. Yeah. And, each to their own, if that's not what you want to do. But if that's what's going to help some people, then that's what's going to help. There are cultures who literally will dig up the bones of their lost loved one a year later and will do stuff with the bones. If you did that in the United States, it's probably against the law. It's probably literally against the law.
It probably is, yeah.
And so in our culture in particular, we're just so phobic and backward about these ideas that it really disenfranchises people. So for Michelle Duggar, who goes through this difficult experience, it's difficult as is.
Right.
But also, and I couldn't find any accounts of like how long she was. Not that necessarily matters, but it does provide some context. But anyway, so it's a difficult thing. It could have been very physically difficult. Right. It could have also been very physically painful or something, who knows. But also just the emotional and the fact that it's so disenfranchised. I don't know. She didn't really talk about it.
But you notice what ends up happening is they blame themselves.
Right.
They're like...
Michelle and Jimbo.
Right. What did we do wrong?
Right.
We must have done something wrong. We need to find the answer so this never happens again.
Right. Which was?
Basically the religion, the system, the
pill.
Well, the pill was the...
But you can see,
thing.
I mean, a
but
bigger
it was like
thing.
The belief system you wouldn't have been on the pill if you would have been in the belief system.
Right.
So if you go on the IBLP, then of course there's no pill. Definitely don't want, you barely have any, no, you don't have contraception.
And I think that, this just occurred to me, there's a pretty good possibility that a sizable chunk of people that are attracted to IBLP or end up in it have a similar motivation to some people that end up in the military. It's not everyone, of course, but if you grew up with abuse, there's a lot of different ways to cope with it. And one of the ways is to tell yourself that you deserved it, or or even to participate in things that are self-sabotaging or even self-harming, right? Not necessarily non-suicidal self-injury, but like putting yourself in harm's way, because it's like, well, if you can't beat them, join them, kind of thing. And you develop this mindset when you're 3, by the way, and so it manifests older. So you can imagine for them and other people, because I've seen this happen. I've treated clients who did this with the military. Again, not everyone in the military is like this, but some are, where they go through that abuse and they give into it in terms of the schema. They surrender to that idea. And then as they start to think about a career or their adult life, they're thinking, they're at this Y in the road where they can finally be free from authoritarianism and from harm, right? But there's a part of them that says, well, but I'm worthless. I need someone to keep me in line. That's not a conscious thought necessarily. And so they are attracted to the military because they predict that it will abuse them in a sense, or control them, or take away their freedoms. And I guess some people might even commit crimes so that, because some people are literally attracted to prison. They want to go there consciously or subconsciously because of the stability, the routine. Anyway, so for some people, they might be attracted to IBLP in this way. And for Jim, Bob, and Michelle, who knows, there's no data along these lines, but you can imagine how they might shame themselves for the miscarriage or something wrong with me. That's very common, right? And I need to fix this. I need to punish myself. Well, I could get both if I join IBLP and I stop taking the pill.
Right. Well, so I did know several people. I guess I've known several people throughout the years in these kind of extreme religious environments who came to that religion after having some very, very hard life problems, like addiction, having been abused, or having had really hard knocks and things, because they found solace in like one of my relatives, for example, was living definitely a pretty hard life, pretty deviating from the norm, let's say. And nowadays he's the most devout reborn Christian you could possibly find.
Yeah, it's a very common story where someone will grow up with trauma, then they enter into addiction, which can be its own routine,
Right.
and its own cult, if you will. Even if it's just you by yourself, there's a system there. You're under someone else's control. You have a prescripted set of behaviors that you have to engage in. And then when these individuals, not all, but some, when they get clean, I have seen a pattern anecdotally, and I think it might bear out in the research, that they might go into the military. Like I said, they might join a cult-like organization without really knowing it, or they might they might engage in extreme sports. Have you ever seen this before?
Yeah.
Like where they become decathlon or Ironman.
Yeah, because it's a spiritual pursuit as well. Yeah.
Right. It
gives them structure.
It's healthy.
Yeah.
But
actually, I have another friend. Who in college was one of the most debaucherous party animals, etc., and then became an extreme Ironman competitor, and his life became the most regimented thing, to the point where we are no longer friends because he never had time for friendships anymore.
Yeah. Right. Now, it could be healthy. It could be it could be slightly unhealthy, but much better than the addiction, right? It keeps them at bay, keeps their addiction at bay, right? Because they have a routine, they know what they're doing, and they with that regimen, you sometimes, like, you can't even think about certain kinds of foods, right? So like I can't eat at McDonald's because I'm training, and I definitely can't use drugs and drink and that kind of thing. So it could be healthy overall, but it could also be unhealthy. It could just be another manifestation of the compulsion to beat oneself up, or, there's obsessive compulsive personality disorder. You can vacillate at higher levels of the disorder between binging and restricting, right? Essentially, it's just like, I'm all drugs and then
rubber banding.
Yeah. And it's either or, instead of recovering from the trauma so that you don't need to engage in that rubber banding. But anyway, so Jim Bob and Michelle, who knows? Maybe there's some data out there. I doubt that there is, but we could imagine one possible story where they both, maybe particularly Michelle, but really maybe both, really went through something significant emotionally after the miscarriage that tapped into also some other traumas in their life. I'm guessing they weren't trauma-free up until that point, and that really either solidified or even just completely pushed them into this lifestyle. And
by the way, so like, have you ever been to one of these big stadium Christian events?
No.
Okay. I will say, these things, I can totally understand why they're powerful for people. I remember I went to a few in high school, and there's so many people, all of them expressing, even though their life might be in total problems and shambles, expressing this outward, like, complete joy and super welcoming, love bombing. Everyone's love bombing everyone. And they're telling stories, and everyone goes through some mystical experience.
Well, you can have another.
Right.
Because that's exactly, you could argue, what IBLP offered on a...
And it's just so powerful that I can totally understand how people are transfixed by that and feel, well, this is the answer. So I can imagine, let's say you have been through something like that and you go to one of these events with Bill Gothard or whatever, tens of thousands of people, and they're all happy and finding meaning and a solution to life, and do this and you won't have miscarriages anymore. It's like, wow, it's powerful.
Yeah, and gives new meaning to that common thing that people would hear after miscarriage of, well, you can have another.
Right.
Because that's exactly, you could argue, what IBLP offered on a platter, which is, you will be having another.
Yeah.
And you will make up for the mistake, because you will never take the pill again. And not only are you going to have another child to make up for the death that you caused, I mean, who knows, but you're going to have you're going to make up for it 18-fold or however many. So that is what happened in 1988 with this young couple that is married. They're in their 20s, Jim Bob and Michelle, and they went on to have many, many more babies after this. On average, a birth every 18 months, by the way, for 19 children.
I was thinking about this, and I know that this used to be more common. It's just so incredible to me to think my body is going through to be giving birth to a new human every year and a half. So therefore, in between times, I'm pregnant and going through that.
And post birth, my body's still recovering, and I'm breastfeeding and suffering from sleep deprivation.
It's overwhelming to think about, let alone go through it.
Yeah, someone online speculated, and I don't know how accurate this is, but they were saying that if they weren't connected with TLC and the money and everything, she would have died at some point, given what she was going through, And she almost did die one time.
Yeah, I know there was
on the show.
Scare there.
Yeah. But yeah.
But also, like, affording that many kids seems like a problem.
Now, there's nothing morally wrong with having 19 kids or being pregnant and giving birth every 18 months, and it's certainly a city folk thing to ridicule, but, there's nothing wrong with it. I will say, though, that there is some research indicating that, and it stands to reason, that the more kids you have, the less love and attunement you can spread out among the children.
And that just seems so intuitive to me.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because I have 2 kids. Balancing the time between 2 kids is hard for me to give each of them the attention that I want to give them and fine tune my style and help them. And that's 2 kids.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that there's some style differences that are of typical Seattle parents today that aren't necessarily if you had to give up part of that parenting style that you have, which I think is great. It's very attuned. It's very personal. There's a lot of time spent, quality time spent. And of course, you can't go wrong with that. But research shows that kids born in other circumstances, maybe there's 6, imagine you had 6 kids and thus you had to split up your time even more. You'd be a little bit more stressed out and frazzled. But if the system is working well, then things can kind of, there's pros and cons. So,
sure.
So the con is that each child gets less daddy time. The pro is that each kid gets more sibling time. And the model of parenting or raising children usually has a lot of extended family involved as well, right? And that's one of the reasons why they believe humans live so long post being able to have children anymore, because the evolutionary advantage of that is that they can make up for the deficits that the parents have. Or
it's just that even just with 2 children, I obviously had to compromise the amount of time and activities I can do with each of them. So for example, when I had 1 child, all the attention's on that child. All the learning is on that child. The tweaking of what we're doing. Okay. When we have the second child, immediately the attention on the first child goes down dramatically, even if we're trying, especially for those first couple of years, because it's a baby. They need attention 24/7.
Yeah, and that's a loss for the older child.
It's a loss. And then for the new child, there's a lot of things I used to be able to do with my single child that I actually can't do with the other one, or at least not that frequently. So they're missing out on that too. Now, again, I'm not saying that therefore their lives are ruined or something. It's great. We do what we can. Could I make it with 3? I'm sure we can. Many people do it with 6. But I'm noticing that difference with 2.
Right. So imagine at 19, I think it just gets really hard.
Yeah.
Unless you have a really robust extended family and you've also raised the older kids not to abuse the younger kids, right? Because you're not able to supervise your kids as they play together as often, right? So
my 7-year-old still needs sometimes, quite often actually, to come sit on my lap, kind of crawl all over me like a cat. My 12-year-old doesn't need. In fact, my sadness with my 12-year-old is I'm like, am I not required anymore, right? But if I had my 7-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old and a newborn baby, I can't, often when that 7-year-old comes to want to sit on daddy's lap, and sorry, I can't. I've got 2 other kids on my lap, let alone and I can't have them because I got to go attend to the baby.
Well, so and you probably have to work 3 jobs just to pay
let
for
alone,
it.
Yeah. So I can,
I mean, I'm curious about this research, but I've always had the hypothesis that if you have a lot of kids, another factor that I would actually see more often as a clinician, as a family therapist in the beginning of my career, the first 10 years, about half my clients were families, particularly teens and their parents. But I would find that families in Seattle would add a lot of dogs to their family. So you might have 3 or 4 kids, 2, 3, 4 kids,
and dogs.
But you also have 7 dogs. And I would see that would interfere with a lot of things. And, the chaos, the sleep deprivation, the space. And so I would actually learn over years to actually, with some families, because I would do in-home therapy and I would observe these things. So I would talk with the parents in private and say, let's have a conversation about moving forward. I'm not saying let's get rid of the dogs now as a dog lover myself, but let's make some smart choices about the phase of life your family is in, and how maybe because of your bleeding heart and you want to rescue all the dogs or whatever, let's think rationally about what is good for you and your children, and maybe for the dogs. Anyway, so that is that. All right, 1990s. Okay. So we're down there, late 20s, early 30s at some or something. And at some point in this time span, and I couldn't really figure out the timeline, they become fundamentalist Christians. They might have already had inklings in the direction, but at some point around here, they become fundamentalist Christians.
Well, so the father, what's his name? Jim Bob. He grew up way more, it sounds like way more on that side of the fence,
right,
than she did.
Yeah.
But yeah, at some point, it sounds like they both really...
But he was allowed to date and marry whoever he wanted to.
It wasn't anywhere.
Obviously, he was okay with her taking the pill, you know. So now that's another part of the story that we'll probably never know. Was the decision for her to go off the pill because Jim Bob was saying, I'd always told you to not take the pill, or was it just Michelle's decision? Who knows? But it's just impossible to know. But anyway, at some point they become fundamentalist Christians, as I would call them, specifically the quiverful movement. Yeah. So what did you learn in all your deep dive around the quiverful movement? Quiver as in a quiver of arrows.
Quiver of arrows. The more arrows you have in your quiver, the better.
Yeah. What? For what though? Quiver meaning children, but
it's for the battle. Honestly, it's for the battle that's coming. It's literally, the end of the world is coming. We need to be on the side of Christ and good, and we need, the more people we have on that side, the better.
Yeah, and or the good people are under attack. We need more ammunition. I mean, there's a lot of metaphors you could come up with aside from arrows and a bow, right? You could say basket full of strawberries or something, Right. We need the basket full, but quiver full. Yeah. It's not like having an AR-15 clip full of bullets, you know what I mean? But, it's ammunition.
It's ammunition.
So,
Well, and so one thing, they didn't go into this much in any of the documentaries I've seen, and maybe because this family in particular didn't give off this vibe, and maybe the IBLP didn't either, but another group that is very concerned with the number of children that is being had are white Christian nationalists, because they're concerned that they're being replaced. And so they have this big movement to, like, you have to be having lots of children. We need to essentially fight back against this. Yeah. And I got that same vein out of all of this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it wasn't explicit, but it might have been, and we just didn't come across it. Yeah. Plus, I'm sure there were people in the IBLP movement who already came to the table with that, or eventually adopted it or something. Maybe not a majority, who knows, but yeah, absolutely. So specifically, the beliefs included that God commands parents, but particularly women, to be constantly pregnant. They wouldn't say it that way.
But you're supposed to, no contraception, period, 0.
Yeah.
2, if you're going to have sex, it should be when you're ovulating to get pregnant.
Yeah. I mean, there was some talk about family planning, essentially just not having sex, right? But the way, and they depicted this pretty well in the documentary, that it was highly elevated at these conferences, the families that had a lot of kids, including the Duggars. These were considered to be the ideal, right? And you were blessed, and so quiverful, blah, blah, blah. So basically the message was women need to be constantly pregnant.
Right, and yet ironically, an obsession with not having sex other than that, because that's bad. Sex is bad unless you're doing this.
Yeah. We'll get into that whole thing in a later chapter. I mean, it's so bizarre. Yeah. Of course, I imagine
it leads to a lot of the problems.
Yeah, and the problem is that most of the world probably adheres to these notions. A
lot of the world,
independent of Christianity.
And it's not just Christianity. There's
Yeah.
these same themes of misogyny and control and sex is bad. That's very prevalent in many parts.
Covering women's bodies. Yeah. So the beliefs are, in my words, God commands women to be constantly pregnant. Of course, no birth control. There's a rigid hierarchy of sexism, and that's based on sexism, and feminism is definitely evil. Maybe not in those words, but essentially that. And homeschooling also, because why do you think the quiverful movement? So this is independent of IBLP.
Right.
It's there's a lot of overlap there, but that was another fascinating thing about this deep dive, is just learning about all these little, it's sort of, I don't know what it'd be like. It's like these little movements within the larger movement of evangelicals or something.
Flavors, flavors. Yeah.
It's like thinking about going to some sort of Comic-Con experience, and you have the Marvel people and the DC people, and then you have
you might have Star Wars fans, right? But the Star Wars fans are subdivided.
Yeah.
There's the Star Wars fans that know all the comics stuff.
Yeah.
Then there's the Star Wars fans that just know it's the 3 original movies. That's what we do, and then but they're all Star Wars.
But then there's the millennials who actually like the
exactly.
prequels, and so it felt like that. It's like, oh, it's interesting.
Right.
But why would homeschooling be part of it? Because you would think it would be easier to have more arrows if the kids are at school, so you can have a break. So why would they have to homeschool, Humberto?
And this is where we could certainly get into the cult discussion. But even besides that, it's you got to control the messaging. You have to control the messaging. The world is corrupt. The world is trying to corrupt me and mine. So and what you're going to learn at school is a lot of stuff that doesn't go to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is you got to be producing more of us.
Right.
And so we're going to
certainly
teach you what you need for that.
Schools don't teach that, and they, according to them, would teach a lot of counter ideas.
Totally.
They would talk about birth control.
Totally. And they do, in all honesty. If you're in this thing and you send your child to school, there's a good chance they'll get out of your movement.
Right. Right. There won't be arrows anymore.
Especially if they go to university.
It's like you're spilling arrows your arrows are turning into just regular sticks.
Exactly. So you want your arrows to actually still be fireable, hence control the messaging.
Yeah.
Control the messaging.
Yeah.
And especially as we get into the IBLP stuff, like now the messaging gets very specific and there's a hierarchy. You're sending kids to a different hierarchy when you're sending them to school.
Right.
That's not our hierarchy.
Right. Where the principal of your elementary school might be a woman.
Oh, God.
Or a lesbian.
Ah!
Yeah. So, Berto, when you think about your experiences recently and in the past, what have you seen people like this around you?
Yeah.
Personally, anecdotally, this kind of thing?
So first off, when I was growing up in Colombia, I'm sure that there were, but I didn't come across, because everyone, the average vanilla flavor was Catholicism. And so I'd go to school. It was a Catholic school. My dad did not allow me to go to church because he's an atheist and he did not allow it. But he would allow for me to watch the mass at home on TV, which I wanted to do because my grandma would go to mass, and my grandma was a huge influence in my life, and she was Catholic, and she would talk to me about God and all these things. So, how you were saying a lot of your experiences were positive. Me too. Like, my grandma never, ever used the religious angle. I don't remember a single time where she said something to me that was like that. In retrospect, I'm like, oh, that wasn't good, but it was couched in religion. No, it was always positive, good things, be good to others. Like, all the things that I wish would still be the main conversation when people are talking about what we should be doing if we're Christians. That's what I got from my grandma. And so I did. I sat there at home on Sunday morning with the TV doing the mass. And
how old were you?
10, 12. I was doing it because I felt like but my dad didn't allow for me to actually go to the church. And at school, it was a Catholic school, so I learned all of the Bible stuff.
So would you do the kneeling and the chanting and everything? Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was my thing. And I had positive things. Now, there were some things at school where I remember, not all the teachers, but some of the teachers would say weird things. And there was a little weirdness around sexuality, but it was nothing that extreme. But what I did notice growing up for sure was how like religion was part of the government, and it was part of the culture, and the hierarchy was definitely there. But I didn't think much of it. I just noticed it.
Was there some inherent sexism that you were internalizing?
Oh, I was not aware of it, but of course, because the hierarchy was men.
Right.
I then left and I came up here, and then things changed. My mom started taking me to church. I was in a youth group. I got baptized because I was never baptized before that. Then I went through confirmation.
Oh, it was a Catholic church up here?
Yeah. And I was very involved with the youth group. I went on all the little retreats and the conferences and the things. I went on a mission trip to Mexico to build a house and a kitchen, and we went to Disneyland. I did all that. It was great, So again, positive. Nothing bad. I wasn't abused. Nothing bad. It was all positive.
Okay.
But I also had these friends that were from high school and who were reborn Christians. Some of them were great. In fact, like I said, one of my best friends was that, and he never was pushy about it with me. He invited me to his church a few times, and they all seemed very nice. There was also this other wing of friends that I had that weren't close friends, but they were acquaintances. We'd be at parties and things, and I certainly talked to them a lot, and some of them were close friends of mine that were very, very about being a reborn Christian. So like I said, this guy that was one of my best friends but he was never...
And I think, by the way, for maybe people who aren't familiar with that term, to me, reborn Christians can mean a lot of things, but I think it also was what we might call conservative Christians or
fundamentalists. Like they believed in the fundamentalists, like the Bible's real, everything's real.
I think it depends. No,
I'm saying the ones I knew.
So just so people understand the context.
Because they, first of all, you had to go through this reborn thing where you had to be rebaptized. It doesn't matter what you were before, you had to be rebaptized. It had to be fully dunking in water, all these things. And like I'm saying, it's not everyone. Like my friend, we always had great times, conversations about everything. And he was a reborn Christian. And he invited me to his church. And actually, a lot of people at his church were lovely. But again, there was this other faction. They were the ones who were always judging everything. Like I said, there was music you weren't allowed to listen to. Movies you should definitely not watch. Shows you should definitely not watch. They were the ones talking about the demon and angel warfare. They were the ones like constantly noticing sins in you and everyone else. And that was there. And when I was invited to those events and churches, I always felt so out of place, judged, and horrible.
I mean, did you know there was something screwy with these people, or
not at first? But I started realizing it. Yeah. So I started backing away from all that because like what happens is they first try to suck you in, but if you are not playing along, they actually like will get aggressive. And but one of my main girlfriends in high school was
did
part
they
of that.
let you be friends with? Did they let your friends be friends with you when you were noticed as an enemy of the church or something?
The church they were in was not the same church as this friend of mine, so that didn't come to pass, but it might have happened. Because I actually know someone else that happened to. As a girl who lost a friend because of that. But one of my main girlfriends in high school was part of this group, of this set of this church, and oh my gosh, it was so crazy. Like the drama and the trauma and everything was dialed to 11. So my experience with it was, wow, there's these flavors. Like you're saying, it's true. It's not that reborn Christian means this. It's just that there was this flavor of it that was extremely overly hyped on every aspect of it. Again, fundamentalist beliefs about the Bible, like everything's real. Angels and demons are real. They're here, they're now, they're fighting for us as we speak. You're always sinning. You definitely don't want to consume any of these things here. You want to only say, and their whole day, every conversation's about it. That's where I was like, oh. And when I went to those events, those were the ones you see in the movies and stuff. That's like this really slick preacher who performs the miracles. They were doing it in this huge stadium. They were healing people left and right. And that's where I started going, oh. And they were talking in tongues. They were doing the, and I was like, okay, I don't think I belong here. And I really started backing away from that world. And
again, we'll get into this more in another chapter when we talk about the religion at length. It might even take a few chapters, but to be clear, belief systems can be benign, they can be positive, but when you look at the pattern as a whole, and particularly certain practices around fear-mongering and us versus theming, then we start getting into cult and high control, brainwashing, and harm, not only to the members, but also to the people connected to the members or the people who come across the members. Having a belief in angels and demons could be benign. You could just be like, yeah, there's angels and demons, but how does it play out in your life? How does it control your life? How does it control your relationships? But if it's a part of a larger pattern where you're constantly being told you need to be hyper vigilant, and anyone who is not of us has a demon inside of them or is worshiping a demon or whatever, and then you start getting those individuals in political office, like the vice presidency, which we'll get into at some point, then you start having actual oppression and harm to not only just people in general, but also the identified others, like the queer people and the foreigners, the dirty people from the other side of the border. It becomes one of the most destructive forces on our planet.
What freaked me out was because I had been on my youth group side, I'd been to some big events, actually also in stadiums with lots of people. These big jamborees where like lots of kids all over, and they're huge. But those events, I'm not saying there can't be bad versions, but like in these cases, it's like, yeah, you are saying, I believe all these things, and you're saying, I'm going to be a better person and stuff. But what I wasn't getting from those was these weird vibes of like, I think I'm being asked to believe magic things because I'm being asked to believe them right now. And of course, it's a fine line because you're like, well, if you're being asked to believe in a God and things, maybe. But again, there was this difference for me where in these other events, there is this highly charismatic figure performing miracles where they're healing people on stage. There are people speaking in tongues. There are constant angel and demons battles. So like the level of suspension of disbelief needed is so much higher. And then the reaction when you don't play along is so aggressive. And you and me being a Catholic, I'm so offensive to this. Unless I submit and go through the thing, that's why I was like, oh no, this doesn't feel right.
At your age and experience level and pre-internet, you're kind of just bewildered, it sounds like. Later you would learn more specifically the problem. Have you experienced people today in today's contemporary times that
I have family members in Colombia that are that believe that the end is nigh. They are and will send me messages saying, "Hey, don't forget, like the world's about to end," and like literally, like I was telling them about something, and it's like, well, in the end, don't forget, like the world's about to end. But then that translates into like COVID denialism, thinking everything's a conspiracy, and therefore they need to go form a commune, which I've heard they want to go and join and stuff. Because again,
I mean, it's kind of weird because, of course, intuitively those things go hand in hand, but logically they don't. Believing the world is going to end doesn't necessitate that you throw out all of science. You know what I mean? Also, what was the other thing that you mentioned?
Well, so like the COVID denialism, but also all the conspiracy theories.
Right. Yeah. You believe that the world is coming to an end. Okay, that's weird, but okay. But why do so many of those people also believe in the conspiracy theories at the same time? And I don't know if they're correlated, but But
in this case, and there are people I love that are fundamental to who I am.
So now, maybe it doesn't cause any harm. Does it cause any harm?
So to me personally, because I don't live there, not directly, not much. I have had some very stressful conversations when I've been down there with some of them, but fine. What I have heard though from other family members is a lot of stressful chaos of people accusing other people of being witches, of people accusing someone of having put a hex on someone, and that's why they're suffering.
Why would they accuse someone of being a witch? Just random, or because they were displeased with someone in the family? Well,
in one case, there was I don't want to go into too much detail because it's my family. But what I'll say is basically part of this belief system is, again, witches are real and around us, and they're trying to bring demons into our lives. So that's real. And so then when they see bad stuff happening, that's a witch. And they don't mean it as a metaphor. They literally mean it.
So are witches specifically of this religion and the teaching? Because
I don't know what kind of, maybe it's a flavor of Latin America but what I know is like to them, all the things of the Salem trials, all that stuff, Like, that's real. Meaning, they probably should have burnt those people because witches are real and they do corrupt.
Is this some sort of legacy? Because your ancestors are from Spain, conquistadors. Is this some sort of legacy of the Spanish Inquisition? Because
certainly, as we know, like, obviously the Catholic part of the country is all because of Spain, and the hierarchy is all because of Spain. The Spanish hierarchy was like, it started with the Catholic Church, right? And like the king and queen were Catholic Church representatives, essentially. So that's all there. Superstitious belief from Europe, I'm sure, that carried over here too. Think of, like, people coming from England with all the witch beliefs and all the things. What I just don't know, like, where the lines are drawn between this and other flavors of it. All I know is that they are, they believe, they're fundamentalist Christians, so therefore they believe a lot of it. But more importantly, they really believe in the magic part of it now, currently manifesting itself all around them.
Yeah. And it causes harm.
And it causes harm to them and the family.
Yeah, and everyone else. Side note, tangent time. In Colombia, is there, and I think this is important to point out because we will often, as Americans, think that we're unique, which isn't necessarily true in a lot of arenas. In Colombia, is there a similar movement, or has there been, regarding the IBLP fundamentalist Christian thing?
Until I saw the documentary, if you had asked me, I'm like, I don't think so. Since they're international, probably there's probably IBLP now.
Well, not specifically IBLP,
but
when you're talking about your relatives, they don't sound like IBLP, but it's in the same category for me anyway, of basically they're being, correct me if I'm wrong, they didn't come up with this idea at the top of the head.
Oh, no, of course not.
They're being brainwashed by a cult.
But it is a different flavor, because what you see a lot here, and actually, now that I think about it, this makes sense. Here's what wouldn't play well with people in Colombia that don't have a lot of money. The really slick preacher with the big watch and this fancy suit asking for a lot of money. So, although I'm sure that exists in Colombia as well, for this demographic, it's actually a lot more, it's like, no, you got to be humble and you got to be helping the poor and the needy. So that part sounds fantastic. In fact, like, all these people that I'm talking about, they spend a lot of their time helping the needy. Like, one of these people, he's devoted his life for this. So it's like, that's all great. And their congregation stuff, it's all about, like, these more humble, like, no ostentatious, we got to help the needy, like, all that stuff. It's just that they add this other layer of, and the world is ending, and COVID's a control thing, and people are witches. And you see what I'm saying? It's like, why can't we have all the good parts?
Yeah.
Throw away all the
Is
other
this a
stuff.
large problem in Colombia?
That's a good question. I don't know how large this movement is. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Well, so going on with my timeline here, 1999. So we're skipping ahead quite a bit. Jim Bob and Michelle have had a lot more kids by this point. Jim Bob serves in the Arkansas House of Representatives. So a state House of Representatives, it's the federal House of Representatives and their state houses. And so he serves for 4 years in the Arkansas House of Representatives. The year 2000, I have a cold, I can't.
In the year 2000.
Speak, I don't have a cold. I'm recovering from a cold from a couple weeks ago. The construction of their 7,000 square foot house began in 2000. So this is the house that eventually is depicted in the show. And they started working on this before they became famous. So it was...
By the way, this always trips me up, because can you imagine buying like a family here? Like, because he was just working class, right? Imagine a working class here in Seattle buying a 7,000 square foot home.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was presumably because they were planning on having a lot of kids, right?
But he was building it himself, basically.
From what I understand. Yeah. And they ran into several problems, and the construction site languished, apparently. So it might have stayed that way if not for future events. But 2002, Michelle wrote an essay in Parents Magazine about her life. So this shows the germination of both of them trying to get the word out.
Yeah, be public personas.
Yeah, becoming public personas, yeah. Jim.
Well, and by the way, I think I learned from the documentary is that the IBLP movement, part of that whole idea was to take over the world. And they didn't see it as a nefarious take over the world. They saw it as like, hey, we believe we're right. We believe this is the right way to live. So the way to make this happen worldwide is we got to get in positions of power. We got to have more kids. We got to spread the word.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So who knows the motivation, but I also think it points to a personality trait. You know, you and I started a podcast. Not everyone does that.
Right.
And I think that
There is some narcissism to it.
yeah, or whatever label you want to put to it, just they like to be on stage or so, who knows. Jim Bob ran for office again. This time he wanted to become a U.S. senator, actually.
Oh, senator. Okay.
Yeah, so he went, becoming elected is a difficult thing to a state house.
Sure.
But to become a senator,
That's
a
a
state,
whole other ball of wax. And you're competing against other very ambitious people.
yeah, there's 2 senators from
Yeah.
each state, and so that's a big deal. But he did run, and he lost. But a very important thing happened while he was running. They were voting, him and his kids. Their kids weren't voting, but they were walking to the polls, apparently.
Oh, right.
And someone took a picture of him and all of his kids,
Right.
maybe for a promo or just a snapshot. And in typical Duggar fashion, they already had their shtick, if you will.
Yeah.
The boys are all dressed in blue, the same outfit. The girls are all dressed in red, I believe, the same outfit. Very cute-looking kids, and they're all walking in a line. It just looked kind of striking.
Right.
Well, that picture, because he was running for U.S. Senate, there was enough media attention for that picture became really well known, and that's what started the ball rolling that would eventually lead to
Right.
them having a TV show. So,
Because it does stand out. You're like, what is this?
yeah.
And at the time, they only had like 12 or...
Right.
Yeah.
So presumably someone at TLC sees this and is just like, Okay. So patron pause, right?
Patron pause.
So he's doing 2 P's.
Patron pause with pause. Meow. It all
So-
makes sense.
Of course. So the rest of this episode will just be for patrons of the podcast. We are arguably getting to what everyone wanted us to start getting into from the very beginning, which is basically talking about the full sequence of when the parents discovered that Josh was abusing his younger siblings. There's a lot of detail there and a lot of things to talk about, actually, because I think the public discourse around this whole thing is not very fair in my book. There are problems, obviously, but there's actually some things that we can point out that the parents and Jim Bob did that I think were responsible. It didn't work out, and it might have been nefarious. But anyway, there's a lot of nuance there, is my point. So if you want to listen to that, become a patron of the podcast. Otherwise, please take care of yourself, because
You deserve it.